a way for him, despite the fact that the real clear.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm John Bass. I'm the Chief Operating Officer with AESA. We appreciate you joining us today for today's webinar on protecting school data and digital assets in a remote world. It's amazing how different our world looks today than it did just a few months ago. And I know that you're all dealing with trying to get schools reopened and kids back in schools, or kids in digital environments. That continues and probably will for quite a while. And security becomes a big issue of that. And we're very fortunate today to have one of our business partners, Microsoft, who has done several of these webinars at no charge to our members, and we sincerely appreciate that. Today's topic is, like I say, is on protecting that data and how do you do that with your networks. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to have, after our presentation from Nick Caromano, hopefully I've said your name right, Nick, but after his presentation, we hope to have questions, dialogue. It'll be a very interactive session because I know you may have some questions for Nick. And at this time, Nick, thank you, and thank Microsoft for being with us today. And at this time, I will turn it over to you. Thanks again for being with us today. Nick Caromano.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everybody, for your time. So just make sure, mic check, y'all can hear me. And I'm going to take those yes. Perfect. So I can't see the chat window, so if there are any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or if anybody else on the team here can kind of help field those. But today's a very important topic for sure. You know, as we start to shift into this remote learning and remote work environment, there's a lot more that we have to think about now beyond our virtual walls, which is typically our campus, our school district, and then the devices that we own and manage. Today's presentation is going to cover a little bit, just briefly, on kind of what does the world look like within education specific to cyber attacks, just to kind of set the stage and why it's important, as I'm sure all of you know. So we won't spend a ton of time there. But then we'll shift into, well, how do we start to leverage some of the tools that Microsoft might offer to help prevent and mitigate and really help to set us up for success as we move more towards building out our security strategies. Now, as I'm sure all of you are aware, we offer a plethora of stuff. So to cover all of that in today's presentation is almost impossible, especially to try and make sure we have time for Q&A. So use this as an opportunity to kind of write some things down, earmark something, circle something in your notes that kind of gets your attention. And I can always help kind of follow up with some additional questions and answers and send over some resources if it's on a specific topic that you might have an interest in. So with that, let's kind of talk about, you know, what does the world look like today? So let's just dive into that. I'm sorry, I think my slide's a little bit of delay. There we go. So to kind of start off, I want to talk about the amount of information that we as in Microsoft pull in on your behalf, and it's a lot. And it's part of the reason why we take security so heavily is because of the amount of telemetry that we call it, the signals, the data points that come in, the analytics, right, that we're able to bring in and dissect and split it up and put it in a million different ways for us to truly get an understanding of what's happening within our customers' environments. So as you can see based on the screen here, I mean, we're pulling in over 470 billion types of analytical data from just email. We're pulling 600 billion endpoints or insights from different documents that are scanned through various services like data loss prevention and our cloud app security services and so on and so forth. So without going over each one of these numbers, as you can see that the breadth and scale that Microsoft is able to bring in all of this telemetry benefits you as the customer at the end of the day. As we start to talk about those unknown attacks, things that we're not really sure what's happening in the world, this type of data backing you as the customer and backing Microsoft as the organization that helps support you is extremely important and vast. And some of this data has started to show some things that are taking place in the world, right, that are kind of scary. So this slide's a good one as it starts to show how cyber attacks and bad actors are starting to leverage things that are taking place within the real world as a method or a means to start to get people to actually fall victim to specific attacks like phishing and so forth. The slide kind of shows you the trajectory that we saw within attacks that are specifically geared around the COVID situation that we're in and the whole pandemic, and leveraging that as a means to kind of instill fear and make people click on links and make people open attachments, and or even so click on things that they thought were coming from their organization as an alert or a means of information related to COVID. So it's kind of scary to see things like that take place. And it's not the first time we've seen this. It happens quite a bit with any sort of large scale, real world kind of scenario that we might be in, where you'll start to see bad actors start to pivot to take advantage of that and really drive home the fear. And with that, as we talk about phishing and what does that look like for email security, it's kind of crazy to think that with all of the messages that we're able to scan, both from us and third-party partners that Microsoft has, and then industry as a whole, that phishing and business email compromise is extremely prevalent, and if anything, growing more and more, maybe just in complexity and severity, but the overall framework is the same. But the reason I bring this one up here is because it's important to note that you'll see under the phishing campaigns that of the top 10 targeted industries, education is one of those. And people don't tend to think about it that way. They think, well, a lot of our majority of users are students and they may not have access to the email, or they may not use email very often, but still staff and faculty are very much important. And even if we have a smaller staff and faculty pool for a target, there's still something that attackers are going to leverage and look at. And student accounts, if anything, are becoming more of a target because they know security is probably a little bit more lax. We don't have multi-factor authentication turned on for kindergartners. And so they start to look for ways to kind of get into your environment. And building on top of that are really these kind of nation state threats. And really what that means is these are more targeted and geared towards a specific company or organization, or in this case, an education institution. And they use much more advanced forms of phishing or social engineering, where we start to see things like credential harvesting. Really, that's just a sign of, we're starting to morph the domain name so it looks like it's coming from something legitimate, but it's not. We used, as you can see in the example here, an R and an N that make it look like Microsoft, right? It looks like an M from far away. So at a quick glance, it's not something that you see as something to be cautious about. And then, of course, just the different types of ways that they can come in and spoof and look like somebody who they're not. So you can see these attacks are continuing to grow, as I mentioned before, which is why I wanted to make sure I mentioned them here, as it's, people hear phishing and they're like, oh, we talked about phishing and anti-phishing and spoofing from years ago. I thought that was already said and done. We're good, right? We don't need to think about it anymore. But it's very much the opposite. It's something to keep on top of mind. And really, from phishing and malicious emails, we start to talk about, well, what is the ultimate goal there beyond just compromising a user account or their mailbox? Times it's, how do I spread malware? How do I spread ransomware? And email is a very easy way for somebody to do that without technically targeting any organization or education institution. They can just do it in mass and look to see who actually falls for it. And so you can see here that our Microsoft Detection and Response team, what we call DART, they are basically our cybersecurity team on our side, and they go to customers and do reactive and proactive support as it comes to cybersecurity incidents and remediation and so forth. And what they're seeing here is just a huge spike in ransomware and the types of attacks that they're having to come in and help resolve after the fact. So it just goes to show that ransomware is one of the biggest growing forms of attack, that can come from something like a phishing email. And the scary part for me, as I support a lot of our education institutions across the South Central area within the United States, is, as you can see by this very kind of eye-gazing eye chart or pie chart, is that education is 62% as of October 8th of the top targeted for malware type of attacks, which could include things like ransomware. So as you look down the bottom of the chart, you can see things like retail and consumer goods. You can see things like healthcare and pharmaceuticals, all the way down to transportation and hospitality. And education is just over 62% of the market as it comes to cyber attacks, and where bad actors are starting to really push their focus and efforts in. And this number can be high for many different reasons, and we won't get into that in today's presentation, but it's something to be cognizant of, as it's a big target when we talk about education and the taking security seriously across all of our institutions. And kind of last but not least, from where are we at today, and I'm sorry, Siri decided she wants to join the conversation, is identity-based attacks, right? So you can see here that Azure Active Directory has seen an increase in cyber or in identity attacks, starting with the whole COVID pandemic, but even slightly before. As we start to move more towards remote learning and remote work, a lot of our now staff, faculty, and students are off campus, right? So they're no longer within the confines of our virtual boundaries. And so what's an easy way to start to attack people is by attacking their user accounts, because environments now. They're cloud facing, they're always available because we want that increased collaboration and productivity no matter where we are. And with that comes an increase in attacks. And so the kind of the counter to that is what we saw with an MFA trajectory, which multi-factor authentication calls went pretty much almost double within a few months when people were starting to respond to cloud-based identity attacks as we move into this remote work and remote learning shift. So it's kind of the end of a little bit of where we're at, right? I didn't want to spend a lot of time there, but just kind of set the stage of why Microsoft is taking security so seriously, across our industry, whether it's education or enterprise or small business. And so how does Microsoft 365 start to kind of help with that? A lot of the solutions here can be a mix of A3, but a lot of them are going to be more towards our A5 SKU. So obviously in the academic side, that makes a lot of sense to you all. So we're going to kind of stick in that realm. But really, by harnessing the power of Microsoft's cloud, we offer customers a security solution that kind of cuts through the complexity and reduces a lot of the pain points that we have when it comes to traditional security solutions, which is, typically by third-party vendors and best-of-breed type of marketing scenarios. And so we kind of stick with this built-in experiences that work across platforms, meaning we don't want our users to have to think about how they access or do something within the environment. We just want them to be able to do it, be productive, and collaborate. But then there's the AI and automation side of this to help secure what does that work look like and what does the future of our institution and our data and our people resources look like. And how do we do that in a way that helps to offset maybe some staffing needs that we have? Maybe we don't personally have a lot of cybersecurity experts on staff within our smaller K-12 district. Or maybe we just have one who has to work the entire thing, but is also the IT manager or whatever the case might be. How do we augment that? And then integrate this across people, devices, apps, and data to where we want to treat each one of those as something that's important and something that is critical to the overall success of our organization as an education institution. So no longer keeping them separate, but treating a user account the same as we would a file, right? A Word document. Maybe it contains social security numbers, maybe it contains student ID numbers, but ultimately at the end of the day, we want to ensure that we're securing as much as we can. And with Microsoft, that kind of falls into these, what we call the 4 cores or 4 pillars of security within Microsoft's world. And that's identity and access management, threat protection, information protection, and then cloud security. And each one of these we could go into an hour's worth of each column, which we won't be doing today. But they all kind of come together to help to create this cohesive and built-in and holistic approach to security. And maybe some of you have heard of things like, defense in depth or defense in layers. It's a very big marketing thing right now that we see in the industry. And really what that means is have as many tools as we can to really secure our environment. And in some cases, that doesn't always work, right? So what we've done is we've taken a little bit of a different approach to that by bringing together the four pillars, the 4 cores of security that we see, and creating what we call a Microsoft 365 Defender Suite. And what this does is it brings together what used to be traditionally siloed approaches to solutions and bring them together in a way to where they talk to each other and they help each other. And ultimately, at the end of the day, help you as the customer who is utilizing these services. So you can see from the left here, we have Microsoft Defender for Identity, which is going to focus more on how do I protect my user accounts when they're on premise, maybe in an old school Active Directory or our legacy environment, but as well as our identities as they move into a cloud first world like Azure Active Directory and so forth. Over to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, where we really focus on the devices themselves, the end user devices themselves. How do we ensure that we're protecting those from things like ransomware, things like traditional viruses and malware and so forth. Moving over to Microsoft Cloud App Security, which is our way to kind of go out and reach into third-party environments like G Suite and Dropbox and Box. And how do we protect data that's going in and out of those environments while creating a cohesive and kind of that single pane of glass, if you will, for Microsoft solutions as well as third parties. And then last but not least is Microsoft Defender for Office 365, which is going to help to kind of span across protecting email, so that email hygiene, that phishing and spoofing techniques that we want to protect against, but also going beyond that and protecting the user after the fact. So they've already received an email, how are we protecting links? And we'll go into a bit more depth in that here in just a minute. But you can see that these all together kind of sound like they do a lot, and they do, each of their own little verticals of an area that they kind of get deep level expertise in as a product. They together start to create this automated cross-domain security platform, or that are known as XDR in the industry. And what that really allows for you as the users or the consumers of this service is to achieve some pretty big goals, in that we want to create that one portal, that single pane of glass. We want to get away from having to jump between multiple complex portals where we have to configure different things, and we might miss an alert from one area because we're focusing on another. Moving over to coordinating active protection from threats. So again, they talk to each other. So when one service detects a threat the other one may not have seen yet, we can go ahead and circumvent the whole process and the delay. As we all know, seconds matter in security, and start to better protect our environment and our users before something even happens. And then automated the healing of these assets that might be affected. So should something have gotten in and infected maybe one or two devices, but we've stopped and mitigated the spread, now we have to go back and automatically heal those two devices that were actually, make sure they're good to return back to the workforce. And then doing all of that while sharing this not only within the Microsoft world, but also with our partners. So we call this the Microsoft Security Intelligent Graph, where we and other vendors actually share data amongst each other, so that if somebody like a Palo Alto or somebody like a McAfee kind of see things before we do, they share that with us and we share that back with them, so that we can all have a uniform data platform to help better protect our customers at the end of the day. And then the threat hunting. So this is a little bit more on the technical side, but really it just means it's giving somebody who is a security analyst or a security engineer the ability to span across different workloads very, very easily and very quickly to identify where the attack came from, what user, what devices might have been infected, and then what were the ultimate remediation steps that were taken automatically or that have to be taken manually. This slide kind of builds on top of that, in that it goes to show that as we start to build on top of automation and leveraging solutions that are more holistic and built together, and built in, not necessarily bolted on, we can see that the numbers start to show drastically the impacts in a positive way that they can have in our environment. Now, these numbers are not necessarily specific to education. I tried to find some that's just not quite there yet. So these are more on the enterprise side, but I think it still goes to show that depending on the environment and the impact that you want to make, there's a lot of good potential here. So we can see that, on average, there's a lot of organizations that have about 50 or plus different types of security solutions, and this helps kind of bring that down and bring it into that single pane of glass we were just talking about. We'll go more into that in just a second. But there is, 60%, 67% increase in attacks in the last 5 years. And so on the security side, that's a lot of alerts that just come at you. And it's just like, hey, pay attention to me. And you don't know which one to really go after, or which one you should spend or give more prioritization over others. And so with that, in our solution, we create what are called incidents, where we do research on your behalf. We pull in the evidence for you. We give you everything that you need to understand and know, and then we can then take automatic remediation if you so choose, or we can leave it at the next step to where all you do as the owner of the service has to click a button, and we take care of the rest for you. So really impactful as we start talking about not having as many people resources available to us. And then the last one is good, I think, even just from an education perspective, as we start to look at how do we set up for success moving forward within the industry. And that's that we have a very large cybersecurity gap from a qualified employee perspective. How do we start to build that up? And in the meantime, how do we use solutions like Microsoft 365 Defender to help augment the lack of people that we have currently available within the market that we can realistically bring into our environment to help better protect our users, our data, and of course the schools as a whole. So kind of going back to the complexity piece for just a second, this is a really good slide that I personally like, as well, as it goes to show just how many different types of solutions Microsoft 365 A5 has to offer, that it can start to reduce that complexity and really build out your return on investment as we talk about, how do we sunset, duplicate services that we can now leverage within a more holistic approach or a stack like Microsoft 365. So you can see the ranges, integrates up to about 40 different security offerings. So when we talk about the actual average, which we see about 70 plus, between 50 and 70 plus different types of vendors within any one organization, whether that's a higher ed university, a K-12 school district, or just a regular enterprise shop, they have a lot of complexity, multiple things doing different things, and sometimes a lot of overlap. And when we start to see that, we start to miss out on those alerts that we briefly touched on before, and we start to create visibility gaps, which we do not want in a security world. So this slide does a great job at kind of showing you those 4 core pillars that we talked about earlier and what solutions kind of fall underneath that from the Microsoft 365 stack. So taking what we just talked about and turning those into some kind of, well, how do we make this work in my head as an example, right? We're going to talk about some of the examples of how this works. I do want to preface that these are more of just questions that we typically see some of our customers ask, and how do we start to line up solutions that kind of meet the overall business need from a how do I secure X, Y, and Z, with one, maybe 2 real world examples of kind of how this starts to fit in. And again, there's a lot more to this that we can always do another deeper dive session in the future, but I think this will be enough to kind of start to at least whet the appetite and get those light bulbs going. So to start, one real quick number is remote learning is here, right? And I think we're all aware of that. 1.4 billion students have shifted to remote learning during the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, with a large increase in virtual remote sessions, whether that be through Microsoft Teams, which is what our numbers show, but even to be more platform agnostic, obviously there's a plethora of investments in the Zoom platform and others like WebEx that are truly showing that education institutions across the globe, and of course across the United States, are really having to shift their mindsets into how do we, excuse me, how do we better support these remote learning efforts? One of the big first kind of questions that we hear a lot is, you know, I need to enable easy and seamless access to applications to all my students, staff, and faculty in a secure manner, right? And we need to do this in a way that's easy for any student, no matter the grade, to kind of get into and access and click on very big buttons, right? And that's where Azure Active Directory comes into play. So we offer a very robust single sign-on or SSO platform that allows you to curate all of those applications that you might provide within your education institution for anybody to access. And it kind of shifts and changes its life based on who's accessing it, right? So a student may not see the same applications that a staff and faculty member might. And of course, staff and faculty, as they might move around the institution, maybe change roles, they go from just a teacher to maybe an assistant principal or so on and so forth, those applications and access capabilities will change along with that, or can if that's how you have it configured. But it also gives you a method of kind of some self-service user capabilities as well. So with the shift to remote learning and remote work, we now need to give our end users more flexibility in how we handle things like self-service password resets, which we can take advantage of here in this portal, and even down to I want to create and manage my own groups. I want to create my own distribution group or my own Office 365 group, which could equate to a team. A lot of this can be done here. It essentially creates that central repository as an organization for you all that makes it very easy to kind of create that one-stop shop and go just branch out into the other services within the environment. One other great thing here too is it helps you to take those applications that are on-prem that may not be so cloud friendly, and very easily with a few clicks of a buttons and some URLs, you can actually project those applications into Azure Active Directory with no VPN, which is another big pain point for a lot of education institutions right now. So we can still offer secure access to applications that are on-prem while maintaining the high security that we need and enforcing things like multi-factor authentication. And kind of going into multi-factor authentication, it's really the next big one there as part of that. How do I secure access, right? This looks a little scary, but it's really not. It takes the complexity and simplifies it quite a bit, but it's an important one to kind of understand. Microsoft and the industry are really pushing forward with what we call zero trust. And it's a mindset, it's a framework, it's not a product, and it takes a while to get there. But what this diagram does that I really like is it kind of helps you to see how we're doing that with an identities lens, where we're understanding how are we taking that zero trust where we always verify, we don't always believe you are who you are, and we want to make sure that whoever is trying to access X, Y, and Z, you are that person and that you have access to that app. And so what this does here on the left, you can see that the various signals that you're going to, that Azure Active Directory actually pulls in on your behalf very, very quickly. So we know the user, we can see the location or the general whereabouts of where they're coming from. We can see the device that they're on. Is it managed? Is it not managed? Is it healthy, right? Has it been up to date or is it potentially infected? And then we use that alongside real-time risk assessments and user entity behavior analytics, which is a really fancy way of we kind of know what this person is supposed to do on Monday through Friday, and we understand that they generally come from these few locations, or they might come from campus, which right now is not so often. And so if it starts to veer off of that, we can then start to identify kind of those indicators of potential risk or compromise from a user, and use all of that within milliseconds to understand how do we want this user to be able to interact with something within the environment. So that next step there is after we get all those signals and we kind of have an idea of what we're going to do, Azure AD then decides based on your policies, what is it allowed to do. So we might say, yep, everything looks great, let them on in, or nope, because they're not on a managed device, we're going to require that they go through an MFA prompt. So they have to pull out their phone and hit I accept or type in a code, or we might force reset their password or just straight up monitor their access to see what actions are they going to take within the application. And we'll talk about monitor access and limited access here in just a minute. But as you can see, all of this happens very, very quickly and allows us to really control the experience from an end user perspective while enhancing security, but still staying out of the way so that users can stay collaborative and productive while they're remote working, while we still ensure that it's the right people who are coming into the environment and doing the actual work and seeing the data that's there. The next piece of Azure AD a lot of people ask for is, I want to be able to audit who has access to what, and I really want my staff and faculty to understand who's got access to or guest access to class teams since we have students involved. And the other big thing right now as well is I have a lot of admins in my Office 365 account. How do I reduce that risk there so that we can't have our admins potentially compromised and then their credentials leveraged to do mass potential damage across our tenant? And that's where we start to kind of dive into identity lifecycle, access lifecycle, and then privileged identity management or privileged access. And really, all of those together kind of help to create what we call identity lifecycle management all up, right? So we understand that if a user changes roles, we're changing what they have access to at any given time, which is a lot easier said than done. But these kind of help to start to give you the foundation and that framework that you need to build on top of to make this possible across your cloud landscape. An access lifecycle is extremely important in the sense of we can do what we call access reviews. And access reviews give you in IT or the business owners or the teachers, faculty, whoever you kind of put as the owner to get a monthly or a weekly audit report of here's everybody who has access to this group or this team. And they can say, yep, everybody needs to stay for X, Y, and Z reason, or nope, these people actually need to go. We're no longer doing business with them, or they were a guest speaker in my class. They no longer need to have access, and we can immediately revoke that. All of it's tracked and audited, so it makes for a really great way to understand who may have potentially had access to PII, especially student data, if they were invited to a class, and were they properly revoked or were they removed within a certain time frame that we kind of have within our own compliance requirements. This allows us to quickly identify that. Privileged access is what allows us to make sure that there's no standing admins. And that's part of the least privileged model that we typically believe in, where you don't want admins to have access or to have administrative rights all the time. It can be very, very bad and very dangerous. And so privileged access allows us to have our admins work under the notion of they are a standard user every day until they need to do something administrative related, where they go and actually request that administrative role. They can go through an approval process if it's a high enough one and we want to control who has the ability to do that on any given time. They always have to use Azure multi-factor authentication so that we can ensure that they are who they are, they have the device that do a biometric check and so on and so forth. And then they can do those administrative tasks for an hour, 8 hours, 24 hours, whatever you deem appropriate in that policy. And once that time frame is up, the role is immediately revoked, which is fantastic. So now later down the road, that administrator maybe falls for a phishing email or gets an infection on their device and it had a credential stealing kind of payload. And that account, since they're not technically an admin in most days, can't do anything outside of just what a typical user would do, which is fantastic. We've then just mitigated a very large risk right then and there by them not being able to have administrative rights out of the gate, which is fantastic. So next up from there is a few more questions here. Let me get these all pulled up. So, we need a multi-platform solution to cover endpoints from sophisticated attacks, right? So this is going to the end user devices. And how do we quickly respond to the numerous alerts? And, how do we start to mitigate or even proactively mitigate what potential surface of attack that we might have within our environment? And that's where Defender for Endpoint starts to come into play. And it's chunked up a little bit here, and we're going to build it out very quickly. But this first part here is one of the most important ones that I find we don't typically see a lot of institutions or IT staff or even security analysts pay a lot of attention to. And I think that's starting to shift. That's my opinion. I'm sure there are a lot of people who do. And that's threat and vulnerability management. And really what that is, it's the research side of understanding what does the exposure look like within your environment, and what do you need to do to mitigate that exposure. Majority of the time, as we talk about device-based exploits or kind of infections that we see, such as ransomware, they take advantage of something that's currently open from a security perspective that hasn't been patched, or an older application that is no longer supported, right? So it's just kind of an open door. This gives you great insights into what does that look like across your environment, so that you understand what is my exposure score, which is something that we provide as part of that, and what steps do I need to take to mitigate that exposure score, so that we can try and stop things from infecting our devices before they even get into the environment, which is always something that we should keep at the top of mind. But then as we build out from that, we have the protect pieces, right? So that's our attack surface reduction capabilities, which are what we like to call device hardening. It's a very meticulous way of going into a policy configuration where we're really controlling what the devices are able to do, and in some cases more restrictive than others. So for example, this is one of the best ways to help protect against ransomware on local devices with controlled folder access. It's very easy to set up, and essentially you just pick your favorite folders that users typically use. So let's say documents and desktops and pictures and so forth. And anytime something tries to make mass changes, which is what ransomware does, it makes extension changes or it encrypts the files, the controlled folder access service will actually stop that service from running. And we can have it to where it'll prompt the user and say, hey, do you trust this application? Or we might go ahead and just say it has to be one of our allowed listed applications. If it's not, immediately don't give the user the option to override. Very powerful capabilities that are included in that service. And going from there is our next gen protection. So how do we actually protect against antiviruses, malware, things like ransomware, and then of course anything that's the unknown side, which is what we start to kind of build out in our detect attacks. So I'll build these last three pieces out here. So EDR, endpoint detection and response, is that how do I understand what's known and what's unknown? So known is usually something that other people have already found, and we have something called a signature that tells us what to look for. Great, we can look for that. If we see that signature and it matches, we know it's bad. The unknown piece, though, so things that come in that we haven't either seen before or work in a different way, something that we like to call fileless, where it's not necessarily a file that's coming to infect it, maybe it's something quite different. EDR is what allows us to kind of detect the behavior of whatever action something is taken. So we know that if something's looking at a specific application, maybe holds credentials for the Windows device that they're using, that's probably a bad thing, right? Not a lot of things should be looking at that, and generally speaking, we know what those applications should be. Or things that might look more nefarious, like it's spreading through, shared folders on premise and deleting mass amounts of files, right? Things that just don't look normal for a day-to-day device to do things with. Or they're looking at groups of domain admins and they're trying to understand who's actually in control or who owns this environment, so on and so forth. And then leveraging that data to understand, is that something that we need to protect against? And if so, it'll kind of go back to what we were talking about before. It'll start sharing that information to the other services like Defender for Office 365 and Defender for Identity to give those services a heads up and a leg up of what to look for, protect against, and stop if it starts to see spread. So if it's an email that came in that has a malicious attachment, Defender for Office 365 will know exactly what attachment to look for and actually can go back and do some after the fact remediation, which we'll talk about in a second. But then the auto investigation remediation is, again, tying into the sharing information and helping the environment to understand in full what's happening, but then actually taking action to stop any sort of spread of that infection or whatever it might be, ransomware and so forth, and keep it at a device level. This is where we start to get into some really cool things like virtual isolation, where we can take a device and basically just keep it isolated to itself. All it can do is talk to the Defender service, and that's about it. So it gives us, you all on the customer side who own and manage the service, to actually have some time to go in and confirm, yes, this device has been infected. Here's what I'm going to do to remove it. Or maybe it's so severe, I'm just going to have the user shut the device down, and then we find a way to swap the device safely, right? The last piece here is the Microsoft Threat Expert service, which is still relatively new, so you may not have heard of it too much, but it gives you the ability to, again, start to augment some of that lack of people resources that we might have, where we might have somebody who's coming into the security world brand new and excited and wants to help out the school district, which is great. But maybe they come across an attack they're not really quite sure how to respond to, or is it a legitimate attack? Maybe it's a false positive. Microsoft Threat Experts is a great way for that person to quickly open up a case right there in the portal and give some notes. Hey, I've seen this attack, or I'm seeing this attack. I've not seen it before. I'm not sure what to do. Can you help? And then within a couple hours, you actually get a response back from a Microsoft security analyst who kind of tells you what's happening, where it came from, what to do next, and how to mitigate it, and so forth. And there's some other benefits with that as well. But very, very good to kind of have the bat phone, if you will, that you can quickly call in times of need. And then, of course, last but not least, this is all multi-platform. So as we talk about with Microsoft's vision for security, we're moving away from just focusing on Windows, right? We want to be there wherever our end users are going to be. So you can see that this obviously would include things like Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and then the mobile devices, iOS and Android, are coming out as we speak right now as well. So we can really get a good holistic view of our entire landscape, regardless of whether it's Windows, Mac OS, or mobile devices, which is pretty fantastic. So kind of moving on from there. So how do we protect users from these malicious emails and attachments, right? How do we look for those links and documents after the fact? Or how do we train the users to understand what does a phishing email look like, and how do we do this elegantly? This next slide is another kind of diagram. So don't let it kind of scare you, but we'll walk through kind of what this is trying to show here. So generally, this is kind of the start of what we would see in an attack that's coming from the email service, whether that's a personal email or it's something from Office 365 that you have more control over. This one's going to be more from the Office 365 side. So you can see that a phishing email comes in, and we go through a multitude of scans and machine learning algorithms that assess and look at the actual mail item itself, as well as any of the attachments that are going to go through or come through with that email. So they get sandboxed, meaning we kind of put them into a fake little environment before it actually hits your mailbox, and we open it and we see what is it doing, what does it try to do, is it try and make calls to things it shouldn't be doing as an attachment, or does the attachment itself look more malicious in intent? And then once that's done, it gets delivered to the user's mailbox. And we offer what we call user click protection, so that when email comes in, bad actors are getting super smart. They know that we have these scanning techniques for when something comes through our initial gateway there. And so what they might do is their link or their document might look fine to begin with, but then the minute it hits the user's mailbox, they actually change things. Maybe they redirect the link to somewhere else that is now malicious. And so they think, hey, it's after the scan, no one will notice. But with Microsoft 365, we have this technique called user click protection. So where when the user does actually click on that link, we actually identify and rescan the end result of where that user is being directed to understand what's happening. And if the action has changed, we redirect the user to a safe landing page. And so this way they can't actually get to that malicious site, which is super awesome. But then once the email is in the mailbox, let's say we have a multitude of email items that have made it into mailboxes, and we've identified that the link has recently switched to be a malicious link. And now we need to go back and actually revoke the mail so that we can just keep people from clicking on the link altogether. That's what we have, what we call ZAP. It's a pretty cool acronym. It stands for Zero Auto Purge, or 0 Hour Auto Purge. And really all that is, it's a fancy way of saying the service itself, once you confirm that, yes, this is a malicious link or a malicious attachment, just because this is end user impacting, so we don't just automatically go out and revoke everything, we can go through the mailboxes, 50, 100 to 200 of them, and remove the message item from the user's mailboxes. So now they don't have the opportunity to click on the malicious link. They see their normal inbox as they would, even if the user has already read the mail item, which is super important. So again, great way to kind of go post-delivery and how we protect the users from that perspective. And then continuing from the post-breach is again, that connecting of the other services that we've talked about so far, right? So it's going to look to see if the user, who we'll call patient zero in this case, if they clicked on the link, did they actually provide their credentials? So were they successfully phished? And if they were, we're going to alert Azure AD, and we're going to alert on-premise Active Directory, hey, this user has potentially been compromised. Here's what to look for. And based on your policies, we can automatically trigger some remediation techniques. So we maybe suspend the user's account. We require they reset their password, or maybe we require that they can only log in if they're on campus, which again, right now is a little bit more difficult, but it's a good kind of in between if they still need to be, working and collaborating, but we don't want to trust their sign-ins coming from anywhere else but our local campus network. And then again, it reports back the email, right? So that email that came in that originally was scanned and said was fine because the link wasn't malicious, we now report back and we send a lot of information that's very important to the link, any attachments, the message item itself, the sender, and so forth, back to the initial there, the protection at Mailflow side, so that it knows moving forward, nope, don't let this in, we don't trust it. And then it shares it with other 365 tenants within the environment as well, so that we're sharing that across our entire customer base as well. So it's super fantastic for us to share all that information back and forth. And then the end user side. Oh, sorry. One second. Looks like my mouse decided to stop working here. So from the end user side, this is kind of tying back to that time of click. So within Word documents, Excel documents, Outlook and Teams, and then including in SharePoint and OneDrive, that same click protection follows the users, and that includes on mobile devices. So if I'm on my iOS device and I'm opening up Outlook Mobile and I click on a link, I get the same click protection on that device, the same as I would on a Windows device. So it's great as it follows the user, no matter where I'm at. Every time I click on that link, it's going to reassess the link and make sure it's taking me to a safe spot. And if not, it redirects me to a safe spot. But then after that, everything said and done, we need to now train our users for those who may have actually clicked on the link and downloaded something malicious. And that's where our attack simulator comes into play. And attack simulator sounds very scary, but it's really not. Its intent is good. It's there to help kind of preemptively train the users by giving them what looks like a legitimate phishing email, hoping to see if they can identify it. And if they do fall for it, we then provide training to the user. So it teaches them what to look out for, why that was a phishing email, what does that mean, the importance of email hygiene, so on and so forth. But all of that's curated for you. We now have the ability to track and train or track the training of the users, which is great. And then you can use this over and over again as your users fall victim to it. We want to leverage this as a way to kind of, again, preemptively mitigate the risk by helping our users understand the importance of identifying phishing emails and so forth. This next slide here is great as it's an actual real world example that I could find that was related to education, which is it's not very common to see here. But you can see it follows almost that same framework that we just went through, right, from the diagram perspective that was just drawn out at the bottom. And essentially, there is a high school economic teacher that we'll just call Mr. Carter in the Midwest who actually opened up a personal email from Gmail using the Mail app in Windows 10. So it was not a work email at all, but it was on a work device. And what happened was, you know, the email was malicious in intent. It started to do a bunch of things it wasn't supposed to do. And because we were leveraging Defender for Endpoint, we were able to see and scan it and sandbox everything that it was trying to do and identify what was happening on that device and stop it before it started to spread across the environment. And all of this happened in 400 milliseconds, which is kind of crazy. So I like to say it's in the blink of an eye, which is very, very true. But again, it kind of shows that even though we didn't have or control where the email was coming from, having the other solutions that holistically talk to each other and understand what's going on with the environment can make a huge impact in helping to spread and mitigate any sort of risk as it comes into the environment. So kind of continuing on here, I'm just doing a time check real quick. I'll make sure we leave time for questions. So this next one is, you know, we want to ensure data containing sensitive data is sent to, you know, external users in a secure way. And how do we allow staff and faculty to control that? We need to understand what type of data and where it lives within M365. You know, and I want to keep data as protected as possible, which is super important as we talk about things that might contain student information like school IDs and, more importantly, social security numbers. And so we offer what we call Microsoft Information Protection, which encompasses a multitude of different solutions like data loss prevention and information records management, and so on and so forth. But really the gist of it is, how do we protect the data at the file level so that no matter where the file goes or what the intent of the file's travel or path is, we know that the file at the end of the day is going to be encrypted. Device encryption, so I'm sure all of you have heard of the term, you know, my hard drive is encrypted or my iPhone's encrypted. It's a great step to have, but now it's become more of a, it's just a must. It always has to be that way. And so the next level there is, how do we start to do that at the file level so that once the file does accidentally leave the device or intentionally, we know that the file is still secured and controlled by the organization that owns it. So you can see here we have a few different ways to do that, but some of the biggest ways is the ability to automatically classify data that's living on-prem as well as in the cloud. And so that really means we're looking for Excel documents that might have a large number of social security numbers or home addresses, or anything that contains PII or even PCI, right? So credit card information. And then we're applying labels to that information so that we can then apply a policy. So something that might be labeled confidential, we might say, okay, to open this document, it can only be opened if you have an internet connection, and you have to be able to authenticate into your organization or your education institution's environment. And if you can't, the document is basically empty. It can't see anything, it can't read anything, there's no point in having that document anymore. That also comes into play with DLP, data loss prevention, which means we can start to handhold our end users to ensure they're only sharing information that's appropriate. So if it does contain an SSN, we're not allowing them to share it via OneDrive, or if they do, it can only go to specific people. And on endpoints, your devices, we can even keep it from going onto a flash drive that maybe isn't encrypted on its own or isn't owned by the organization. Lots of very big, powerful techniques and capabilities there. And this spans beyond just the Microsoft world. So it's on-prem, it's obviously Microsoft 365 and SharePoint, Teams, Exchange, and all that fun stuff. But again, being able to reach out into non-Microsoft clouds using our cloud app security solution to go into things like G Suite and Box and Dropbox and Slack and so forth. And so this kind of leads up to the next piece, is how do we control third-party cloud identifier or applications? I'm going to go a little quick on this so that we can get to the Q&A. This is a great solution to allow us to help look for shadow IT. So what are people in my environment or even remotely trying to access and leverage because maybe we are being too restrictive or we're not offering the right services? This gives you great insights into what people are doing on the devices that you manage and what applications are they going to. So if you offer OneDrive for Business, why is everybody going to Google Drive, or why is everybody going to Dropbox? And this allows you to take action. We can block those applications from being allowed on our devices, so we can unsanction them, or we can kind of adopt them and say, okay, maybe for specific use cases, we have a use for Dropbox for whatever reason. And so we're going to adopt it and bring it into our platform. And now we can start actually enacting policies and protect the data as it goes out into Dropbox, a non-Microsoft solution. One of my favorite pieces of this, though, is the ability, kind of going back to that session monitoring and session control, is based on what the user is trying to do and the risk that they have. So are they on an unmanaged device? Are they coming from China? Are they coming from Brazil? Or are they in Texas or somewhere that we are familiar with them being? We can change their experience. So if they're logging into, say, Microsoft Teams, we can actually say they can only view files and chat and do anything in the browser, but they can't download data. They can't open any documents in Office on the workstation itself. They have to do everything in that browser session. They can't cut, copy, and paste. They can't print. But if they immediately switch to a managed device or whatever your policy states, we can revert their session back to what they expect. So they have the full capabilities of Teams, they can download things, they can upload things, so on and so forth. But as you can see, all of this is done on the fly, meaning that we can very quickly and drastically change the experience of the users to help better secure the data. At the end of the day, that's the most important piece, while still allowing them to be productive. And part of that is the devices themselves, right? So typically on the left-hand side, MDM, mobile device management, is where we take full control of the device, and that scares people. And there's reasons for that, right? If IT accidentally sends a device wipe command, your device has been wiped. You just lost all of the pictures of your cats and dogs and family. Now, not to say that happens all the time, but it's a legitimate fear. But the idea behind it is that we want to ensure the device is safe and meets our requirements. So how do we do that without taking full control of the user's device? And that's where MAM, mobile application management, comes into play. We just control the applications that they're using to access our data. So they're accessing school email through Outlook. They're using Microsoft Teams and SharePoint and OneDrive. And then if they ever leave the institution, so they're no longer a staff or faculty member, or they're a student and they're just moving on, we can actually just remove the work stuff or the school stuff from that device and those applications and leave everything personal alone. So it doesn't affect all the pictures of their cats and dogs. And even in Outlook, for example, if they have a personal Outlook account in that email application, it doesn't affect that at all. It just simply pulls their school email out, which is fantastic. So last kind of little bit here is, what does all of this look like together? So it's going to look similar to a diagram that we previously saw, but you can see that we're browsing to a website where really the intent is to try and exploit and install malicious applications on our device. Maybe it came from a phishing email, or we opened an attachment or clicked on a URL that was bad. And ultimately, what they're trying to do is take command and control of our device and ultimately maybe our user account. So they've compromised your user account, whether that be through the device or something like brute force, where they just keep pounding on my account online. And then they start to move around our environment on-prem to try and look for ways to take over the environments, right? So they want to take the keys to the kingdom, if you will, with the ultimate goal really there to either compromising our environment entirely, or their big objective there is to exfiltrate data. So what can they take from the institution that is going to be important and worth money for them, right? So maybe files with social security numbers in it as an example. So this starts to overlay the solutions that kind of altogether build what that holistic approach is going to look like. So email, we have Defender for O365, Defender for Endpoint for our devices, Azure AD Identity Protection for those cloud-oriented user objects, excuse me. And then for on-premise, we have the Defender for Identity to help protect on-premise Active Directory. And then at the end of the chain here is Microsoft Cloud App Security to help protect and look for data that's leaving our environment and enforce policies like the encryption piece I was talking about before. And this really quick, just to kind of give you a brief example of what a dashboard could look like for you, is this is our security center within Microsoft 365 with all of these services lit up. And it starts to create that single pane of glass. So you can see very quickly, as somebody who is monitoring or looking for anything that is something that's priority for me to take action on, this helps to kind of bring all of that to one single pane of glass so I can quickly understand what does my environment look like and where do I need to start to focus on. So as you can see here, I have expert multi-stage incident, meaning that's something that's taking action right now. It's affecting many, many things within my environment. I'm going to go click on that right now and start looking at what do I need to do to mitigate beyond what the service has already done for me, which is pretty powerful and saves a lot of time at the end of the day. And lastly, just a quick little Microsoft security quote here, but we embrace our responsibility to create a safer world that enables organizations to digitally transform. And that obviously more than ever encompasses education as we start moving to remote learning and remote work. And with that, that's the end of the presentation. So I thank you, and I will turn it over to see if there's any questions.
Any questions from the group? Please just unmute yourself and feel free to ask at this time. One more chance. Any questions? I guess you covered it very thoroughly, Nick.
I hope so.
Everybody understands everything about security now.
Right? Everybody's now a little bit of an expert. That's the goal. But there is a lot. So I will make sure that there's a copy of the PowerPoint that was done today so that you can all have a copy of that just to kind of go through and see for yourselves. There's some references to where the metrics for the data at the beginning of the slide came from. And then, if there are any additional questions, I'm always happy to help out where I can.
Very good. Well, thank you again, Nick. We appreciate you. Appreciate Microsoft. Thank you for those that are with us today. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Anything that we can do to connect you with the right folks at Microsoft, we'd be more than happy to do that. So, Nick, thank you. Renan Friels, who's behind the scenes with Microsoft. She's always helps us arrange these webinars. Thank you for your help, Renan. And with that, we'll see you at our next webinar. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.